The rope bit into Adaline Kirby's wrist before it ever touched her ankles, and she knelt in the wedding dress her mother had died sewing, the hem soaked through with grass and something darker, 6 men on horseback closing the circle around her like a noose drawn slow. She did not look at the guns. She looked at the tree line, counting the seconds between one rider's cough and the next man's spit, because counting was the only thing left that belonged to her. The 7th rider came last, and he came alone. He wore a coat the color of an old wound, and his horse stepped into the ring without hurry, without announcement, the way a man walks into a room he already owns. The others turned their pistols toward him out of habit more than suspicion. Silas Vane was known by reputation before he was known by face, and reputation said he did not draw unless the money was already in his pocket. "Mrs. Thorne?" one of the riders said, the words aimed at Adaline like another kind of rope. "On your feet." She did not move. If you have ever knelt in a field and understood, all at once, that the men around you have already decided how the story ends, you know why she counted seconds instead of praying. Adaline Kirby had learned 2 days ago, kneeling over her father's body in the north pasture, that prayer changes nothing a rifle hasn't already decided. What changes things is knowing exactly who holds the rifle and why. If this story finds the same knot in your chest that it found in ours while we built it, put your hand on that feeling for one moment and press the subscribe button below. Not because a channel needs numbers, but because there are more women who buried something this year and haven't said so out loud, and stories like Adaline's are how we find each other in the dark. Silas swung down from the saddle. His boots found the grass without sound, which was its own kind of warning, and the man who had spoken, young, sunburned, new enough to the work that his gun hand still trembled when he wasn't watching it, took a step back before he caught himself. "She's not getting up," Silas said, "until somebody tells me why 6 grown men needed rope for one woman in a wedding dress." 2 nights before, Adaline had signed her name to a marriage contract with a pen that did not belong to her, in a parlor that did not belong to her anymore, while her father's body lay under a sheet in the room across the hall. Colonel Ezra Thorne had stood at her shoulder the entire time, close enough that she could smell the leather and gun oil on him, and when her hand shook over the final line, he had placed 2 fingers against the back of her wrist, not gripping, just resting there, a reminder of what his hands could do if her hand stopped shaking on its own. "Your father owed me the valley," he'd said. "You're paying the difference." She had looked down at her own hands then, at the ink drying black across her knuckles, and understood that everything he called a debt was a lie built to look like arithmetic. The Kirby land had never belonged to Thorne. But paper believed what paper was told to believe, and the only man who could have contradicted the paper was already cooling in the next room. Reverend Amos Doyle had performed the ceremony with his prayer book trembling worse than her hand, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder the entire time, refusing to meet hers. Because a man who married a grieving daughter to her father's murderer under armed guard could not afford to look at what he was doing and still call himself a man of God the next morning. She had wanted in that moment to hate him more than she hated Thorne. It was easier somehow to hate a coward than a wolf. The wolf, at least, made no pretense of gentleness. Thorne had smiled at her once the papers were signed, a smile that did not reach the rest of his face, and had taken her chin between 2 fingers the way a man examines livestock he's finally satisfied with. "You'll thank me for this in a year," he'd said. "A woman alone on land like yours draws every vulture in the territory. I'm simply the one who got here first, and had the decency to marry you before taking what I came for." Decency, she'd repeated, and something in the flatness of her own voice had made even Thorne's smile falter, briefly before he recovered it. "You'll come to see it that way," he'd said, releasing her chin, already turning toward the men waiting to escort her to the wagon that would carry her toward the ceremony that would make his theft look, on paper, like a woman's willing choice. "Everyone does eventually. It's easier than the alternative." She had not answered him. She had looked instead at her father's chair by the cold hearth, empty now for 2 days, and promised herself, silently, that whatever eventually looked like for other women Thorne had broken this way, it would not look like that for her. Back in the circle of riders, the sunburned man found his voice again. "Colonel's orders. She runs. We're to make sure she don't run twice." "Funny," Silas said. "My orders say bring her back alive. Somebody's arithmetic is wrong." He didn't reach for either revolver. He didn't have to. There was a stillness in him that made the horses shift under their riders, animals reading a danger the men were too proud to admit. And when he finally did move, one hand unhurried, toward the rope at Adaline's wrists, 3 men drew on him at once. The first shot came from behind him, not from his gun. A rider fell before Silas had even turned, and by the time the others understood what was happening, 2 more were down, and the rest were scattering into the tree line, like something had reached into the circle and rearranged it from the inside. A rifle, propped against a stump 100 yards back, had done the work Silas's reputation only implied he could do himself. A second man, someone he'd paid to watch his back before he ever rode into the clearing, though Adaline wouldn't learn that detail for another day yet. Adaline stared at the blood misting the grass 6 feet from her knees, and for one long second she tasted copper at the back of her own throat, though nothing had touched her mouth. Fear did that. Fear put blood in places blood had never been. "Can you ride?" Silas asked, already cutting the rope from her wrists with a blade she hadn't seen him draw. "I can ride better than I can trust you," she said. "Fair," he said, and pulled her up onto her feet in the same motion he used to check the tree line. "We'll work on the second part later." 2 of the surviving riders had already broken for the trees, but the third, the sunburned one, the one whose hand had trembled, stood frozen over the body of a man he'd shared a bedroll with for 2 winters, and it was Adaline, not Silas, who saw the exact moment his fear tipped over into flight. She watched him go without satisfaction. There was nothing in this field worth satisfaction, only the cold arithmetic of who was left standing. The second shooter caught up with them an hour past the pasture, a lean, gray-bearded man named Otis, who rode with a Sharps rifle slung across his back the way other men carried a walking stick, an old habit, worn comfortable by decades of use. He said nothing about the 3 men he'd dropped from the tree stump, only nodded once to Silas, and fell in a half-length behind, and Adaline understood, watching the wordless economy between them, that this was a partnership built on something older than the coin the colonel's lawyer had offered. "You didn't tell me you had a second man in those trees," she said once Otis had ridden ahead to scout the trail. "You didn't ask if I worked alone." "I didn't think to. Most men in your line of work like the credit." "Most men in my line of work don't live long enough to worry about credit," Silas said. "Otis and I rode together in the war. He saved my life more times than I've bothered counting, and I expect he'll go on doing it whether I count or not." It was the first thing he'd told her that had nothing to do with the job at hand, and she found herself grateful for it, a small scrap of a man who existed before this errand, before the pasture, before whatever he was now becoming in the space of these frightening days. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek running low with the season, and it was there that Adaline finally allowed herself to look at the dress she was still wearing. 3 days ruined now, the hem black with mud, the bodice torn where one of Thorne's men had gripped her arm, hard enough to leave a bruise she hadn't yet had the stillness to notice. She knelt at the water's edge and scrubbed at the worst of the stains with hands that had never done this kind of work, her mother's careful stitching coming apart, thread by thread, under fingers too rough with fear to be gentle. "Leave it," Silas said, crouching a few feet away, filling a canteen. "The dress doesn't need saving." "You do." "It's the only thing of my mother's I have left that isn't buried in a box somewhere," Adaline said, and heard her own voice crack on the last word, the first true crack since the pasture. "I know that's a foolish thing to care about with everything else." "It's not foolish," he said. "Grief doesn't ask permission for what it decides to attach itself to. Mine attached itself to a pocket knife for 2 years after the war. Man doesn't get to choose what carries the weight of what he's lost." She looked up at him then, surprised by the gentleness in it, and found Otis watching them both from a little distance with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between approval and old tired sadness, the look of a man who had seen this particular kind of careful tenderness bloom before, in other fields, under other circumstances, and knew exactly how fragile it was against the world waiting beyond the creek. They rode until the mountain swallowed the last of the daylight, Adaline's torn dress snapping like a flag behind her, and when Silas finally called the horses down to a walk, she asked him the only question that mattered. "Who hired you?" "A man who paid me half up front and told me the rest comes when you're delivered somewhere quiet." "Delivered where?" He didn't answer that, and the silence that followed sat between them thick enough to touch, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but crowded, with things neither of them had decided yet to say out loud. They rode 2 more hours in that silence, the horses picking their own way through country neither of them knew well, and Adaline used the time to study him the only way available to her, sideways, in glances she hoped he wouldn't notice, cataloging the things a man's body says when his mouth won't. He rode like someone who had spent more nights sleeping in a saddle than in a bed. His right hand never strayed far from his hip, even when the trail was empty, and twice when the wind shifted and carried the smell of smoke from some distant chimney. His shoulders tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke and everything to do with memory. They found an abandoned line shack an hour past midnight, half its roof caved in by some old winter, but the door still held a bar across it, and Adaline dropped that bar into place herself the moment she was inside, her palm flat against the wood, as though she could feel through it whether anyone was coming. "You don't trust the door either," Silas said from the far side of the room, watching her. "I don't trust anything with a heartbeat within 20 miles of me. The door's just easier to test." He almost smiled. It cost him something to let it show, and she filed that away the way she filed everything now, evidence, not affection. He built a fire small enough not to smoke and set water to boil, in a battered pot he'd carried in his saddlebag, and when she flinched at the sound of a branch cracking outside, he didn't reach for his gun, didn't move toward her. He simply said, low and even, "Dear." Nothing with boots walks that heavy and that careless, and went back to feeding the fire, letting her decide for herself whether to believe him. She decided eventually that she did. Morning brought the first real conversation, the kind neither of them had the luxury of avoiding any longer. "You said a man hired you," Adaline said, working a knot out of her hair with fingers still raw from the rope. "Not the colonel." "I never met the colonel. Money came through a lawyer in Cheyenne. No name on the letter." "Convenient." "It's how I like my employers. The less I know about who's paying, the less I have to decide whose side I'm on." "And now?" He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured rather than admired. "Now I've got 3 dead men behind me who thought I was on theirs. That tends to clarify things." 3 men isn't clarity. It's just fewer people left to lie to you." "Maybe," he said. "But it's a start." Otis returned from scouting the trail behind them with news that settled uneasily over the little camp. Dust on the horizon, riders moving in no particular hurry, which was somehow worse than a hard chase. "Men who ain't rushing," Otis said, crouching to warm his hands, "are men who already know where you're headed and don't need to catch you today." "Larkspur," Adaline said. "They know I'll go to Ruth." "Then we go a longer way than they expect," Silas said, "and we get there before they've finished being patient." She pressed him further while they ate, hard bread, a little dried meat, nothing that tasted like more than fuel. And he answered in pieces, the way a man tells a story he's not sure yet how it ends. He'd been a soldier once, on the losing side of a war neither of them cared to name in detail. After that, a man who moved cattle for other men's brands, then a man who moved information for other men's secrets, then eventually a man who moved people, sometimes towards safety, sometimes away from it, and he'd stopped asking which direction was which so long as the money cleared. "That sounds like a man who's used to not caring," Adaline said. "It was," he said, "until a field full of men pointed guns at a woman in a wedding dress and called it a wedding." She studied the line of his jaw in the gray morning light, the way he kept his eyes on the horizon even while speaking to her, a habit of a man who had learned the hard way that comfort and vigilance rarely afford themselves at the same moment. "What did you do in the war?" she asked, "before all the moving of cattle and secrets and people?" "Cavalry," he said. "I was good at it, good enough that they kept finding new reasons to send me back out, until there wasn't much left of who I'd been before it started. I came home to Missouri and found the home gone, burned in a raid nobody bothered to explain to the people who lived there. After that, one kind of work looked much like another. I stopped asking whether a job was honorable and started asking only whether it paid enough to keep moving." "And now?" "Now I've got a woman across the fire from me asking questions I don't have practiced answers for," he said. "That's new. I'm not sure yet if I like it." By the 3rd day they had crossed into country Adaline didn't recognize, and it was there, over a fire built low enough not to smoke, that she gave him the second half of the truth she'd been rationing since the pasture. "There's a woman named Ruth Calloway. She kept house for my father since before I could walk. If anyone in this territory knows where my father hid the real deed to our land, it's her." "The real deed," Silas repeated. "Thorne's contract says we owe him the valley. We don't. My father sold him nothing, borrowed nothing, signed nothing, until 2 men held a gun to his hand the same way they held one to mine. There's a true will somewhere. Ruth has it, or knows where it sleeps." Silas turned that over, the way a man turns over a coin to check which side is counterfeit. "If that's true, the colonel doesn't want you delivered quiet. He wants you delivered gone. That's what I've been trying to tell you since the pasture." Why didn't you say it plainly? Because for 3 days, she said, I wasn't sure if I was telling it to a rescuer or to the last man who'd hear it before it stopped mattering what I said at all. He had no answer for that, and to his credit, he didn't try to manufacture one. He only nodded once, the way a man nods when a debt has been named that he intends to pay, whether or not he's decided yet how. That night, unable to sleep, Adaline sat apart from the fire and looked at her own hands in the dark. The ink stain from the marriage contract had faded to a gray shadow across 2 knuckles, but she could still feel where the pen had pressed, days after the fact, the way a bruise keeps its ache long after the color has gone. She thought of her father's hand doing the same thing, forced flat against a different page, and understood for the first time the particular cruelty of Thorne's method. He did not simply take. He made his victims participate in their own taking, so that afterward some small, treacherous part of them would always wonder what they might have done differently, as if the crime had ever belonged to them at all. She was still awake when Silas came to sit a careful distance away. Not close enough to press, close enough to be heard. You're not sleeping, he said. Neither are you. I don't sleep well after killing men, even when they had it coming. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her yet, and something in her chest loosened slightly to hear it, not because it comforted her, but because it meant he was at least a man who counted his costs, rather than pretending they didn't exist. Tell me about your father, Silas said, after a silence long enough that she thought the conversation had ended. Not the will, not the debt, just him. She hadn't expected the question, and it took her a moment to find an answer that wasn't shaped by grief alone. He built the first fence on that land with his own hands the year I was born, she said finally. Used to say a man who won't work his own boundary line has no right complaining when someone else decides where it sits. He wasn't a gentleman exactly, but he was fair, and out here, fair counts for more than gentle most days. Sounds like a man worth the fight you're making for him. He'd have hated all this, she said, gesturing vaguely at the dark around them, the fire, the fugitive nights, the hiding, the needing rescue. He'd have wanted me standing in that pasture with my own rifle, not kneeling in a dress waiting on somebody else's mercy. Maybe, Silas said, or maybe he'd have wanted you alive long enough to fight the way that actually wins. There's more than one kind of standing your ground. She had no answer for that, but she found, turning it over long after he'd gone quiet, that she didn't entirely disagree. On the 4th night, camped in a shallow draw where the fire's light couldn't carry far, Adaline woke to the sound of Silas already awake beside the coals, his revolver laid across his knee, not drawn, just present, the way another man might keep a Bible within reach. She said nothing at first, only watched him watching the dark beyond the firelight, and after a while he spoke without turning. You should sleep. Tomorrow's a hard ride. I keep dreaming about the pen, she said, not the guns, not the rope, the pen and how heavy it felt in my hand, like it weighed more than any rifle ever could. That's because it did, he said. A gun only threatens what happens to your body. That contract was built to convince you your body was all you had left to decide with. That's a heavier kind of weapon than most men ever learn to fear. She considered that a long moment, the fire popping low between them. You talk like a man who's thought about this before, about what a signature can steal that a bullet can't. I've delivered enough people to enough fates to have thought plenty about what actually breaks a person, Silas said. It's rarely the violence itself. It's the moment someone convinces you the violence was your own doing. Thorne didn't just want your land, Adaline. He wanted you believing you'd handed it to him, willingly. That's the crime underneath the crime, and it's the one that'll take longest to heal, whatever the judge decides. She found, listening to him, that some of the coldest fear she'd carried since the parlor eased its grip for the first time, not gone, but seen clearly, named by someone who understood exactly what had been stolen and exactly why it mattered. She moved closer to the fire then, not for its warmth so much as for the simple comfort of not sitting quite so far from another person who understood, and settled near enough to him that their shoulders nearly touched. Neither of them acknowledged the closeness directly, but neither did either of them move away from it, and they sat like that a long while, the fire between them shrinking to embers, the particular silence of 2 people who had each expected, only days before, to face whatever came next, entirely alone. Otis says I talk too much when I'm tired, Silas said eventually, a small, dry attempt at lightness that felt coming from him like its own kind of gift. I don't mind it, Adaline said. I've had enough of men who say too little and mean too much of it badly. I'll take this instead. He glanced at her sideways, something almost like surprise crossing his face at the plainness of the admission, and for a moment in the dying firelight, she thought she saw the same careful, measuring look settle over him that she so often turned on others, as if he, too, were only now beginning to trust that what stood in front of him was exactly what it appeared to be, and nothing more complicated underneath. The attack came just before dawn on the fifth day, while the camp was still wrapped in the particular dark that comes right before first light, when a man's eyes are least trustworthy and his instincts slowest to wake. Otis heard them first. A stone displaced somewhere beyond the tree line, wrong in a way that no animal's footfall would have been, and he had his rifle up and Silas roused with a single low word before the first shot ever came. There were 4 of them, riders who had picked up the trail somewhere in the last day without any of the 3 noticing, and they came in fast and reckless, more concerned with finishing the job than with any care for their own safety, which told Silas plainly enough that Thorne had started offering a bonus for speed over caution. Adaline came awake to gunfire close enough that she felt the report of it in her chest before her mind caught up to understanding what was happening, and her first instinct, trained now, hard won in the days since the pasture, was not to freeze but to get low, to find the horses, to make herself small and useless as a target while the 2 men who knew this work handled what she could not. It was over in under a minute, though it felt, living through it, like the longest minute of her life since the rope first touched her wrists. 2 of the riders went down in the first exchange. A third broke and ran the moment he understood the numbers had turned against him. The 4th, young, unfamiliar, clearly new enough to this work that his hands shook as badly as Jed's once had, found himself staring down Silas's revolver at a distance of 6 feet and made the only sensible choice left to him. "Don't," he said, both hands raised, the gun already falling from his fingers into the dirt. "I don't want no part of this no more. Man never told us he was hunting a woman for keeping her own land." "Then ride back and tell whoever sent you," Silas said, "that every man who comes after her from here on rides into the same math these 2 just lost. Tell them the numbers get worse the longer the colonel keeps sending them." The boy fled without his gun, without his hat, without, Adaline suspected, any further appetite for the wages Thorne was offering, and in the gray light that followed she found her hands shaking harder than they had in days, not from the danger just past, but from the cold understanding of how close the arithmetic had come to running the other direction. "You're still here," Silas said, crouching in front of her, checking her over with quick, careful hands for any wound she might not yet have noticed in the rush of it. "That's what matters. You're still here." "I keep thinking one of these mornings the numbers won't hold," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "One of these mornings there'll be 5 of them, or 6, or the one man who doesn't hesitate the way that boy just did." "Then we make sure Larkspur comes before that morning," Silas said. "One more day. We can survive one more day." The town of Larkspur sat one day further, a town Adaline's father used to call Thorne's front porch, because every deputy, every judge who passed through, every man behind a store counter owed the colonel something he wasn't proud of. Riding down its main street felt like walking into a room full of men who already knew her name and had already decided what to do about it. Shop windows caught her reflection in fragments, torn lace, wind-ruined hair, a face that did not look like the bride who had signed the contract 5 days ago, though she supposed, in every way that mattered, she was still her. Otis peeled off from the group a mile outside town, choosing to circle wide and watch the roads rather than ride in plainly, a precaution Silas insisted on the moment the first rooftops came into view. 3 riders together draw eyes, he said. 2 draw fewer. Otis draws none at all, which is exactly the point of him. Deputy Cole Briggs found them before they'd tied their horses. "Miss Kirby," he said in the voice men use when they already know they're about to do something they'll regret. "The colonel's put out a warrant. Says you took his property and ran." "His property," Adaline said, "was never his to claim. That's a matter for a judge." "Then find me one who isn't on his payroll." Briggs's jaw worked, and for a moment Adaline thought she saw the shame of it cross his face, not enough to change what he did next, but enough that his hand shook slightly, reaching for his cuffs, the way a man's hand shakes when his body still remembers being decent, even after his choices have stopped being so. "I'm not cuffing you today," he said finally, low enough that only she and Silas could hear it. "But the colonel's got eyes on every road out of this town, and I've got a family that eats because I still hold this badge. Don't make me choose between you and them in daylight." "Then don't watch too closely tonight," Silas said. And something passed between the two men that wasn't quite an agreement and wasn't quite a threat, the particular understanding of men who both knew exactly how thin the ice was under all of them. Briggs lingered a moment longer than the exchange required, his eyes moving over Adeline's ruined dress, her wind-burned face, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had not slept a full night since her father's death. Something in his expression shifted, some old decency fighting its way up through years of small compromises. "Your father helped my family through a hard winter once," he said quietly. "Never asked for it back. I haven't forgotten that, whatever else I've let myself become since. I won't make it easy for the Colonel to find you. That's the most I can promise today." It wasn't much, but Adaline had learned in the 5 days since the pasture to weigh promises by the cost of making them, not by their size, and a deputy risking his badge for a debt 6 years old was worth more to her than it might have seemed to anyone watching from outside the moment. Ruth Calloway's house sat on the edge of Larkspur like it was trying to be forgotten, and when she opened the door to find Adaline standing there in a dress 3 days ruined, she did not scream, did not startle. She simply pulled her inside and barred the door behind them both. The same gesture Adaline had made in the line shack, an instinct passed hand to hand between women who had learned the same lesson from different men. Ruth's hands, when she finally took Adeline's face between them, were shaking worse than Adeline's own. "I heard you were dead," she said. "I heard your father was dead, and you'd been married off the same week, and I told myself I'd bury you both in my prayers, because there wasn't a thing left in this world I could do for you otherwise." "There's something you can do now," Adaline said. "Your father sent something here 2 months back," Ruth said, before Adaline had even finished asking. "Told me if anything happened to him, I'd know who to give it to. I didn't understand what he meant until I heard he was dead." She went to the family Bible on the mantel, the one Adaline remembered from every Sunday of her childhood, and drew from between its pages a folded document gone soft at the creases from handling. "This is his will," Ruth said. "Signed, witnessed, dated the week before the Colonel started calling in a debt that never existed." Adaline took it with both hands, and for the length of a breath she pressed it flat against her chest, the paper crackling faintly against the torn lace of her dress, the way a person holds the one thing in a burning house they cannot leave behind. "There's more," Ruth said, and something in her voice made both Adaline and Silas go still. "2 witnesses signed this. One's already dead, old Simmons, the blacksmith, passed of fever last winter, God rest him, but the second is still living, Deputy Briggs' own father before he took sick and went to live with kin in the territory north. If the son won't testify to what he knows about the Colonel's dealings, the father might, if someone can reach him." It was the first thread of the layered truth Adaline hadn't yet pulled, proof not just that the will existed, but that men still living could swear to its making if fear didn't silence them first. Ruth set a plate in front of Adaline that neither of them expected her to finish, and sat across from her the way she had 100 times in the Kirby kitchen before the world had rearranged itself so completely. "Your father talked about you in those last months," Ruth said. "Said the Colonel had started sniffing around the property line the year prices dropped, offering to buy at half what the land was worth, and getting meaner each time your father said no. He never told me he thought it would come to killing. I don't think he'd let himself believe a man could do that over acreage." "Men have done worse over less," Silas said quietly. "I know that now," Ruth said. "I didn't want to know it a month ago." Adaline reached across the table and took the older woman's hand, the same hand that had braided her hair as a child, bandaged her knees, taught her to read scripture, and to bake bread in the same patient voice. "You kept this safe," Adaline said. "Whatever comes next, you already did the hardest part." It was in Ruth's kitchen, over coffee neither of them drank, that Silas said the thing he'd been circling since the pasture. "The lawyer in Cheyenne who hired me. I sent a rider back to ask around while you two were talking. Man's name is Delacroix, works exclusively for one client." Adaline already knew before he said it. She'd known in some buried way since the moment he refused to look at her when she asked who delivered Gone actually meant. "Thorne," she said. "Thorne," Silas confirmed. "I was never hired to bring you back alive for a wedding. I was hired to make sure you disappeared somewhere nobody would ask questions. The ambush in the pasture wasn't a rescue gone wrong for him. It was insurance, in case his own men lost their nerve." Something in Adaline went very still, the stillness of a woman recalculating every kindness of the last 3 days for a blade hidden inside it. And you're telling me this because I burned the letter with my instructions 2 nights ago, and I've been trying to find the nerve to tell you since." He set something on the table between them. Ash, mostly, the corner of a page that hadn't caught. A single line of handwriting still legible. "Ensure the Kirby matter is resolved permanently." Adaline looked at her own hands where they rested on the table, at the ink-stained knuckles that had signed a marriage contract 5 days ago, and understood that the men who wrote sentences like "resolve permanently" about a living woman had stopped thinking of her as one, a long time before the wedding. "How long have you known?" she asked. "And let me sleep 20 feet from you without saying it." "Since the first night. I told myself I'd say it when I understood what it meant to say it out loud. I understand now. I'm sorry it took me this long to earn the saying of it." He had in truth spent that first night at the line shack turning the letter over in his hands, long after Adaline had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, reading and rereading the single damning line until the words blurred, and asking himself the question he'd successfully avoided for 10 years of this work. What kind of man finishes a job like this? He had told himself, riding out from Cheyenne with Delacroix's coin heavy in his saddlebag, that the particulars of a job were none of his business, that asking too many questions was how a man in his line of work ended up dead, or worse, indebted to answers he couldn't afford to know. He had believed that mostly until he watched Adaline Kirby refuse to beg in a field full of men who expected exactly that from her. Something about the particular dignity of her stillness had made the letter in his saddlebag feel, for the first time in a decade of similar letters, like something he could not simply deliver and forget. He had burned it that first night by the fire, alone, while she slept, and had said nothing of it for 2 more days, telling himself each morning that he would find the right moment, and finding instead that the right moment kept receding behind the next danger, the next mile, the next small proof of trust he wasn't yet certain he deserved. She didn't forgive him in that moment. She wasn't sure yet that forgiveness was owed, or if it was even the right word for whatever was growing, slow and wary in the space between them. But she didn't ask him to leave the table either, and in the arithmetic of the last 5 days, that counted for something. Otis raised the question none of them had wanted to voice aloud. If this lawyer Delacroix works exclusively for Thorne, and if he's the one who drew up the payment for Silas's job, there's a paper trail sitting in a Cheyenne office right now, connecting the colonel directly to the order that nearly got you killed in that pasture. That's not hearsay from a frightened writer. That's a document. Getting it would mean riding 2 days out of our way into a city crawling with men who know my face by now, Silas said. And Delacroix's not a man who hands over his client's business willingly, even under pressure. Then we don't ask him willingly, Otis said. There's a federal marshal stationed in Cheyenne who owes me a favor going back further than I care to admit. A properly worded subpoena from Whitcomb, delivered by a marshal instead of the 3 of us riding in with guns showing, might get further than anything else we could try. It took 2 more days to arrange, letters carried back and forth by writers Otis trusted with his life. But the paper came eventually, a payment ledger from Delacroix's own office, subpoenaed under federal authority, showing a disbursement to 1S. Vain in an amount matching exactly what Silas had described, drawn against an account belonging unmistakably to Ezra Thorne. It was not on its own proof of murder intended, but laid beside the burned letter's single surviving line, and beside everything else Ruth and Otis and Jed had already gathered. It closed one more door Thorne might otherwise have used to claim ignorance of his own men's methods. Jed Marsh found them that night behind Ruth's stable. The youngest of the colonel's riders, the one whose gun hand had trembled in the pasture. He came with his palms open and his hat in his hands, which in that country was as close to surrender as a man could offer without dying for it. I didn't sign on to kill a woman in a wedding dress, he said. I signed on because the colonel pays better than ranch work, and I've got a mother in Cheyenne who eats because of it. But I've got a limit, and you people found it. What do you want? Silas asked. Briggs is holding a cell open with your names already chalked on the board. He means to arrest you both before sunup on the warrant, hand you to the colonel quiet, before any judge asks questions. I can get you out the back when it happens. I can't do more than that. Adaline studied him the way she'd learned to study every man since the pasture, for the seam where the lie would show. She found none. Why now? She said. Why you? Because I looked at you kneeling in that grass, Jed said, and thought about my mother. That's the whole reason. It doesn't need to be bigger than that. And Briggs' father, Adaline said, watching his face carefully. Does he know the old man witnessed my father's will? Something flickered across Jed's expression. Surprise, quickly buried. I didn't know that, but I know where he's staying. If it matters to you, I can carry a letter north for you before this is finished. It's the least I owe for what I almost let happen in that field. Briggs came for them at dawn exactly as promised, and the cell was cold and small and smelled of rust. But Jed was waiting with the key 3 hours later, exactly as promised too, and by the time the sun was fully up, Adaline and Silas were back in Ruth's kitchen with the true will spread flat on the table and a plan taking shape around it like frost forming on a window, slow, then suddenly everywhere at once. A federal circuit judge comes through Larkspur twice a year, Ruth said. Judge Elias Whitcomb. He's due within the week for the fall docket. He's the only man in 300 miles the colonel hasn't managed to buy. Then we need Thorne in the same room as the judge, the same room as the will, at the same time, Silas said. He'll never walk into a courtroom of his own choosing, Adaline said. No, Silas agreed, but he'll walk into a church. Ruth's letter went north with Jed the same afternoon, folded small and sealed with wax, addressed to a man who had not spoken his son's name aloud in 3 years, but who, Ruth swore, still kept a Bible with his own signature pressed between the same pages as every other important document of his life. Otis arrived at Ruth's back door that night with his hat pulled low and news that could not wait until morning. Thorne knows you're in Larkspur, he said. Man doesn't have proof yet, but he's got suspicion, and suspicion's enough for a man like that to start tightening the roads out of town. If we're going to move on the judge, we move before he decides suspicion's worth acting on. Then we don't wait for Jed's letter to come back, Silas said. We wait exactly long enough, Adaline said, and not 1 hour more. If Briggs' father won't sign a sworn statement, this whole plan is built on a will and a prayer, and I've had enough of prayer doing the deciding for me. Later that night, once Ruth had gone to bed and Otis had taken up his watch at the edge of the property, Adaline and Silas sat by the low kitchen fire and mapped the plan itself in the plain, unromantic terms it required, not the language of confrontation and justice she'd been using in her own head, but the practical mechanics of getting a dangerous man into a room he would rather avoid. He won't come for a court date, Silas said, sketching a rough line in the ash at the hearth's edge with a poker, but a church on a Sunday with the whole town watching. That's an audience he can't resist, correcting in front of. Man like Thorne needs witnesses to believe he's still in control, even walking into a trap. His pride is the door we're using. Same as his men's fear was the door Jed walked through. And if his pride tells him not to come at all, Adaline said, if he simply stays on his own land and lets Whitcomb rule in his absence, then we lose the theater but not the ruling, Silas said. Whitcomb doesn't need Thorne present to void a forged contract. What we lose is the town seeing it happen with their own eyes, which matters more than paper alone, if you want people believing the truth of it rather than merely the legality. I want both, Adaline said. I want the ruling, and I want every soul in that church who ever looked away while he did this to someone else to watch him lose in front of God and the judge in the same breath. Silas studied her for a long moment in the firelight, something like respect settling into the line of his mouth. Then we make sure the invitation reaches him in a way his pride can't refuse. A public notice posted at the church door itself, naming the hearing and the hour. Man like that won't be able to stand the thought of the whole territory, watching him choose not to show. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind of waiting that stretches thin and taut over everything. The whole town of Larkspur seeming to hold its breath without knowing exactly why, the way animals go still before a storm they can smell but not yet see. Adaline spent the days helping Ruth mend what could be mended of her mother's second dress, the good one, the one that had survived the fire that took the first years before Adaline was born, and it was strange. Threading a needle through fabric meant for a wedding while planning what amounted to a public trial, disguised as one. Silas spent the days elsewhere in town, watching, learning the shape of Thorne's remaining men, counting how many still rode for the colonel, and how many, like Jed, had begun to wonder whether the pay was worth what it cost them to keep collecting it. He returned each evening with fewer words than he'd left with, the particular quiet of a man carrying more than he wanted to burden a woman with. On the second evening of that waiting, a boy no older than 10 came to Ruth's back door with a note pinned to a stone. Thrown, the boy admitted with wide, frightened eyes, by a rider who'd paid him $1 and told him not to look back. The note was in a hand Adaline recognized from the marriage contract, from every ledger and letter of thorns she'd ever had cause to read. I know where you're sleeping. I have chosen not to act on it. As a courtesy to the woman, I still consider my wife under God, whatever paper Whitcomb entertains. Reconsider your position before Thursday. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Silas read it twice, his jaw tightening in a way Adaline had learned meant more than any raised voice could have. He's not threatening the trial, he said. He's reminding you he can reach you whenever he decides the courtesy's expired. Then we make certain Thursday comes before his patience does, Adaline said, and found saying it that her voice held steadier than it had any right to, given the note trembling faintly in her own hand. Ruth burned the note in the stove that night without being asked, the way she'd burn anything that carried Thorne's hand across it, and the small domestic violence of that act, flame-taking paper, ash where menace had been, seemed to settle something in the room that words alone couldn't have managed. The third day brought Otis back from a ride to the county recorder's office 2 towns over, where land grants and title transfers were kept in ledgers that predated even the oldest disputes in the territory. He returned with a folder of copied pages and an expression Adaline had learned to associate with useful, if unwelcome, news. There's a second forgery, he said, spreading the pages across Ruth's table. Not just the marriage contract. 3 months before your father died, somebody filed a partial transfer of the north pasture, the same field where they took you, in the county records, using a signature the recorder's clerk swears looks nothing like the one on file from your father's original land grant. Nobody caught it because nobody thought to compare the two side by side until I asked. Adaline studied the 2 signatures Otis had laid beside each other, her father's true hand, careful and slightly cramped from an old injury to his writing fingers, and the forged one, smoother, more confident, the handwriting of a man who had never once in his life had cause to fear the pen he held. This is the proof that ties it together before the will even comes into it, Silas said. Not just that he forced a signature after your father's death. He was manufacturing paper months before it, building the lie in layers so that by the time your father actually died, there'd already be a trail suggesting he'd been selling off pieces of the land willingly for months. Which means this wasn't grief-driven cruelty in a moment of opportunity, Adaline said slowly, the full shape of it settling over her like cold water. This was planned. Before he ever put a gun to my father's hand, he was already building the story that would let him get away with it. Otis nodded grimly. Man like that doesn't act on impulse. Everything Thorne does, he does with the ending already written. Comforting thought for a trial. Considerably less comforting for anyone who has to live near him in the meantime. Silas spent the 4th evening at Ruth's table and finally said what he'd clearly been rehearsing. Whatever happens in that church, he said, I want you to know I'm not standing behind you because I was paid to. I burned that letter. Nobody's paying me for what happens next. Then why are you here? Because I'd like to be, if you'll let me be, for reasons that have nothing to do with a contract. She looked at him a long moment, and something in his eyes, steady, unflinching, the kind that seemed to hold their own quiet light even in the dim of Ruth's kitchen, made her believe him more than she'd believed any man's word in longer than she could remember. Judge Elias Whitcomb arrived in Larkspur the following afternoon, a full day ahead of the fall docket he'd been expected for, and Ruth arranged a quiet introduction at her own kitchen table before the public notice at the church door could reach him through any channel Thorne might have already compromised. He was older than Adaline had pictured, silver-haired, deliberate in his movements, with the particular tiredness of a man who had spent decades reading the worst of what people did to one another and had somehow not let it curdle him into cynicism. He read the will in full silence twice before setting it down and looking at her directly for the first time. I've heard the colonel's name before, Miss Kirby, he said. Complaints filed and quietly withdrawn. Witnesses who changed their testimony between one court date and the next. I've never had enough in one place to act, only enough to suspect. What you're bringing me is considerably more than suspicion. Is it enough? Adaline asked, unable to keep the rawness out of the question. It's enough to open a proper hearing and to compel a man to answer for himself under oath, which is more than anyone in this territory has managed in 6 years of trying. Whether it's enough to convict rests on how thoroughly you can back this document with living voices willing to speak the truth in front of him. I understand you're working on precisely that. "We are," Silas said. "Then do it quickly," Whitcomb said, folding the will carefully back into its creases. "A man who forges paper and burns barns doesn't wait patiently while a woman builds her case against him. I'd rather you finish gathering what you need before he decides silence is worth more to him than patience." He left them with that, and Adaline found, watching him go, the first real thread of hope she'd allowed herself since the pasture. Not certainty, not yet, but the particular relief of finally standing in front of someone whose authority the colonel could not simply purchase away. The colonel's answer to the news that his bride had resurfaced was not subtlety. He arrived in Larkspur 3 days later with 11 riders and the particular calm of a man who has never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, and he came, as Silas had predicted, to the church, because a public wedding interrupted was, in Thorne's calculation, still a wedding that could be finished by force in front of witnesses too frightened to object. He found instead the entire town packed into the pews, Judge Whitcomb seated at the front in his traveling robes, and Adaline Kirby standing at the altar not in chains but in her mother's second dress, the good one, the one that had survived the fire that took the first. "Adaline," Thorne said, and there was something almost gentle in it, the practiced gentleness of a man who has never had to mean the word to use it well. "Come home. This has gone far enough." "It has," Adaline said, "which is why I brought a judge instead of a groom." Thorne's eyes moved past her, cataloging the room the way a general reads a battlefield. The judge at the front pew, the deputy near the door, the townspeople packed shoulder to shoulder, in a silence too total to be accidental. Adaline watched him understand in the space of that single sweeping glance that he had walked into a trap built entirely of witnesses, the one weapon his money and his men had never learned to answer. "You'd humiliate yourself in front of the whole territory," he said, "over paper that means nothing without my signature on it." "It means everything without your signature on it," Adaline said. "That's precisely the point you never understood, Colonel. You forged consent because you needed the world to believe I gave you something willingly. A woman kneeling in a field with a rope on her wrist was never proof of a marriage. It was proof of exactly what you are." Thorne's gaze shifted briefly to Silas, standing near the front pew with his arms crossed, unarmed by choice in a house of God, and something like recognition passed over the colonel's face, the particular fury of a man realizing the tool he'd purchased had turned itself, deliberately, into the very weapon aimed back at him. "You," Thorne said, "I paid you well enough to make this woman disappear quietly. I should have known better than to trust a man with no loyalty beyond his last invoice." "You paid me to finish a job I never fully understood the shape of," Silas said, his voice even, carrying easily to the last pew despite its quiet. "I understand it now. I'm returning the second half of your money to the court today, along with everything else you'll answer for. Consider us square, Colonel. More than square." A murmur moved through the pews, low and uneven, the sound of 200 people quietly recalculating a story they'd been told for months by a man they'd been too afraid to contradict. She held up the will, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, she would admit only to herself, did, not from fear this time, but from the effort of holding 5 days of terror at bay long enough to finish a single sentence. "This is my father's true will, signed and witnessed the week before you claimed he owed you this valley. There was never a debt, Colonel. There was only a forged contract and 2 men who held a gun to a dying man's hand until it looked like consent." The church went the kind of quiet that has weight to it, a held breath multiplied by 200 people, and into that silence Judge Whitcomb rose from his seat. "I have here a sworn statement," the judge said, "given 3 days ago before a notary in the Northern Territory, from a Mr. Elijah Briggs, attesting to the signing of this will and to conversations he witnessed regarding threats made against the late Mr. Kirby by parties acting on Colonel Thorne's behalf. I'll examine the document itself now, and I'll want any further witnesses brought before me within the hour." "Colonel, I'd advise you not to leave town." Deputy Cole Briggs, standing near the church doors in his badge and his shame, looked at the mention of his father's name, and for the first time since Adaline had met him, made a choice that cost him something real. He stepped forward in front of the whole congregation and said the words he'd been too afraid to say in any private room. "I took money from the colonel to hold that warrant quiet and keep the courts from looking too close," he said. "I'm saying it now because my own father put his name on that will, and I won't let his signature mean less than the coin I took to bury it." Thorne's calm did not break so much as curdle. He looked at the judge, at the deputy who had just ended his own career to tell the truth, at the townspeople who had stopped pretending not to watch, at Adaline standing where a bride should have stood submissive and stood instead like a woman reading a verdict she had written herself, and something in his face decided that if he could not have the valley by paper, he would take it by fire. "You'll regret this," he said to her, quiet enough that it carried only to the front rows, though every soul in that church seemed to feel the weight of it regardless. "Paper burns, Adaline. Everything you're holding up right now burns." "Then burn it," she said. "I've buried a father and worn a rope for your convenience already, Colonel. There is nothing left in that valley you can take from me that costs more than what I've already survived losing." He held her gaze a moment longer, some calculation passing behind his eyes, and then he turned and walked out of the church, with his remaining men falling in behind him. Unhurried, unbowed, a man who had lost a room but had not yet, in his own accounting, lost the war. Nobody in the church moved for a long moment after the doors swung shut behind him. Then Judge Whitcomb rose fully and addressed the gathered town, his voice pitched to carry to the last pew. "I want it understood," he said, "that this court takes no pleasure in a public spectacle, and I would have preferred these matters settled with considerably less drama and considerably more paperwork. But I have seen enough here today, and enough in the documents already presented, to know that Colonel Thorne will answer for what has been done to this family, one way or another, under the full weight of federal law. I ask that no one in this town take justice into their own hands in the meantime. Let the law finish what it has started." It was a reasonable request, delivered with the full authority a circuit judge could muster. It would prove within hours entirely insufficient to stop what came next. In the immediate aftermath, before the church had even fully emptied, Ruth found Adaline's hand and held it tight, and Adaline realized only then how badly her own legs had been shaking beneath her mother's dress, adrenaline finally catching up to the composure she'd forced herself to hold through every word she'd spoken to Thorne's face. Townspeople she barely knew came forward in twos and threes, murmuring quiet words of support she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to receive. An older woman pressing her hand briefly, a shopkeeper's wife saying only, "Good for you, dear, good for you," before disappearing back into the crowd, as though even that small courage cost something she wasn't yet ready to spend publicly. Silas found her at the church steps as the crowd thinned, his expression unreadable in the way it became whenever he was doing careful arithmetic behind his eyes. "He won't let this rest quietly," he said. "A man like that, humiliated in front of his own territory, needs to answer it with something bigger than words. We should assume tonight, not tomorrow." "Then we don't sleep tonight," Adaline said. "No," he agreed. "We don't." The barn went up 2 hours after midnight, the Kirby barn, the last structure on the land that still held her father's tools, his handwriting on the beam where he'd marked her height each birthday since she was 6. Adaline woke to the smell of smoke thick enough to taste and ran the half-mile in her bare feet, Silas half astride behind her the whole way, and by the time they arrived the fire had already taken the roof. She stood at the edge of the heat with her hands hanging useless at her sides, because there was nothing left to save, only the watching, and it was Silas who caught her by the shoulders when she started forward anyway, some animal instinct insisting she could still reach the marks on that beam if she only moved fast enough. "It's gone," he said. "Adaline, it's gone." "He's trying to burn the proof that I exist," she said, and for the first time since the pasture her voice cracked clean down the middle. "If there's nothing left of my father's hand anywhere, it's easier to say none of this ever happened." "There's still the will," Silas said. "There's still the judge. He can burn a barn. He can't burn a signature that's already in a federal circuit court's possession." She looked at her own hands again, still empty, still shaking, and made herself straighten her spine the way her mother used to straighten a hymn before church. Not because the fear had left her, but because a woman who stands up straight is harder to mistake for someone already defeated. Otis arrived not long after, having ridden hard the moment he'd seen the glow of the fire from his watch post at the property line, and he circled the wreckage once on horseback before dismounting, his face grim in the gray dawn light. "No sign of the riders who set it," he said. "Long gone before I got here. Coward's work. Burning a barn in the dead of night rather than facing you honest." He looked at Adaline a moment, taking in the exhaustion and grief plain on her face, and added, more gently than his usual gruffness, aloud, "You held together in that field with 6 guns on you. You'll hold together through this too." I've seen enough of what you're made of to have no doubt of it." Ruth arrived at first light with a shawl and a face gone gray with worry, and it was Ruth, not Silas, who finally coaxed Adaline away from the wreckage long enough to sit and drink something warm. "Your father rebuilt that barn once before, you know," Ruth said, settling beside her on an overturned trough that had somehow survived the fire untouched. "Lightning took the old one the year before you were born. He stood exactly where you're standing now, looking at nothing but ash, and told your mother he'd have a new roof up before the first snow. He did it too. Took every able hand in 3 counties, and more stubbornness than any one man should rightly have, but he did it." "Oh, I don't have his stubbornness," Adaline said. "I've been running for 5 days. I don't know how to build anything. I only know how to survive whatever's thrown at me next." "You're wrong about that," Ruth said, taking her hand, the same hand that had once bandaged Adaline's childhood scrapes, now steadying a grief far larger than any scraped knee. "Surviving what's thrown at you is the first half of building something. You've already done the hard part. The barn's just wood and nails. Anyone can raise those, given time and enough hands willing to help. What you did in that field, and in this town since, that's the part your father would have recognized as truly his." When Ruth finally went inside to see about breakfast for the exhausted household, Silas sat down beside Adaline on the same overturned trough, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, watching the last of the smoke curl up into a sky just beginning to gray with dawn. "I keep thinking," Adaline said eventually, "that if I'd simply signed whatever he wanted from the start, none of this would have burned. My father would still be gone either way, but there'd be a barn standing, and Ruth wouldn't have spent the night up worrying, and you wouldn't have 3 men's deaths on your hands because of me." "You didn't put those men's deaths on my hands," Silas said. "Thorne did, the moment he decided a woman's signature was worth more to him than her life. You've done nothing tonight but refuse to let a liar's arithmetic decide what you're worth. That's not a burden you should be carrying alongside the actual crime. It doesn't feel that simple sitting here." "No," he agreed. "It rarely does the morning after. But simple and true aren't always the same thing, and I'd rather tell you the true version than the simple one that lets you sleep easier tonight and blame yourself for it come next week." She looked at him then, something in his steadiness settling the worst of the guilt threatening to take root in her chest, and found herself for the first time since the pasture unafraid to lean the smallest amount of her weight against his shoulder and let him bear a portion of what the night had cost her. Jed found them at the smoldering edge of the wreck an hour later, breathless from riding hard through the dark, his horse lathered from the pace he'd kept, and the news he carried was the second escalation neither of them had expected. "I heard 2 of the colonel's men talking near the bunkhouse before I rode out," Jed said, still catching his breath. "Didn't think much of it at first, but the more I turned it over on the ride here, the more it sat wrong with me. 2 of the men who set that fire," he said. "They're Thorns, but they're scared enough of a murder charge that they'll talk if someone gets to them before the colonel does. I know where they're holed up." "Then we get to them tonight," Silas said, "before Thorne remembers the same thing you just did." They found the 2 men in a line shack not unlike the one where Adaline had first learned to trust the sound of Silas's voice in the dark, and it did not take much. A promise of leniency from a federal judge weighed against the certainty of Thorne's noose once he decided they'd become a liability, before both men agreed to swear, in front of Whitcomb himself, that the order to burn the Kirby barn had come directly and explicitly from the colonel's own mouth. It was the 3rd revelation, the one that closed the circle entirely, not merely a forged contract, not merely an arson, but a documented, witnessed, unbroken chain running from Ezra Thorne's hand to every act of violence committed against the Kirby name since the day her father died. But it was the smaller thing one of the 2 men said, almost in passing, that lodged itself deepest in Adaline that night and would not let her rest. "You ain't the first," he'd admitted, unable to meet her eyes even in his confession. "There was a family up near the Powder River 3 years back, widow and her boy. Colonel wanted their water rights. Boy disappeared one winter, and nobody ever proved it was Thorne's doing, though everybody who worked for him at the time knew better than to ask questions about where he'd gone." Adaline sat with that a long while after the man had finished talking. The fire between them burned down to embers, and felt something harden in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "A boy," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "He's done this before, and taken more than land before, and nobody stopped him because nobody had proof enough to try." We'll have proof enough this time, Silas said. Whatever it costs to gather it. Find out the widow's name, Adaline said. If she's still living, if there's any family left to speak for that boy, I want them told what's happening here. Somebody ought to know that Thorne's finally being made to answer, even if it's for a different family's grief than his own. Otis rode north again the following morning, and returned 2 days later with word that the widow had passed the winter before, worn down by grief and isolation, but that a cousin still living near the Powder River had agreed, once persuaded of the seriousness of the matter, to travel south and add her own account of Thorne's dealings to whatever record Whitcomb was building. It was not proof enough on its own to charge him with the boy's disappearance. That crime, unwitnessed and unconfessed, would likely never see a courtroom, but it was enough to establish, in Whitcomb's own words, a demonstrated pattern of using violence and coercion to acquire land and resources belonging to vulnerable households, language that would matter a great deal when it came time to argue against any leniency in sentencing. Adaline never met the cousin in person before the trial, but she read the woman's written statement twice through, alone in the quiet of Ruth's kitchen, and found herself weeping for a boy she'd never known, whose name she would not learn until the statement itself named him, Caleb, 11 years old, last seen walking toward the river his family had refused to sell. She folded the statement carefully and pressed it, for a moment, against her chest, the same instinctive gesture she'd made with her father's will weeks before, though this grief was not hers to claim, only hers to carry forward on behalf of a mother who hadn't lived long enough to see it answered. On the ride back from that line shack, exhausted and smoke-stained, Adaline finally allowed herself to voice the fear she'd been carrying silent since the barn first caught. "What if it isn't enough?" she said. "What if Whitcomb hears every witness we can gather and still finds some reason to let him walk free? Men like Thorne have walked free from worse before. I've heard the stories my whole life." "Then we gather more," Silas said. "And if that's not enough, we gather more again. I didn't burn that letter from Cheyenne to watch you lose this in a courtroom the way you nearly lost it in a pasture. Whitcomb's an honest judge, by every account Ruth and Otis could find on him. That's rarer than gold in this territory, and we happen to have one riding through at exactly the right week. That's not something either of us should waste doubting." "You sound certain." "I'm not," he admitted. "But you've survived worse than uncertainty this month. I expect you can survive a little more of it until the ruling comes down." She laughed then, for the first time since the pasture, a short, surprised sound that startled even her, and something passed between them in that laugh that neither of them named aloud but both of them recognized, the particular relief of finding, in the middle of the worst month of a life, someone whose presence made the unbearable merely difficult. The morning of the trial, Ruth insisted on braiding Adaline's hair with the same careful hands she'd used every Sunday of Adaline's childhood, and it was in that quiet, ordinary act, a woman's fingers working through another woman's hair, unhurried, familiar, that Adaline finally allowed herself to cry, not from fear this time, but from the sheer accumulated weight of everything the last 2 weeks had cost her, released at last into hands gentle enough to receive it. "There now," Ruth said, not stopping the braid, letting the tears come without comment, the way only someone who has raised a child truly knows how to do. "You've earned every one of those. Let them out today so you've got nothing left in you but steady when you walk into that courthouse." Adaline let herself be held a moment longer, and then straightened, wiped her face, and let Ruth finish the braid in silence, gathering herself thread by thread the way her mother's dress had once been gathered, stitch after careful stitch into something whole enough to wear into the fight, still waiting for her. Silas waited for her on the porch when she finally emerged, dressed plainly himself for once, no coat of a color that announced him from 100 yards, and he said nothing about how she looked, only offered his arm the way a man offers steadiness rather than admiration, and she took it, grateful for once not to need to explain what the gesture meant to either of them. "Whatever the ruling," he said as they walked toward the waiting wagon, "you've already won the part that mattered most. You made him answer for it in front of people who used to look away. The rest is only paperwork catching up to a truth this whole territory already knows." "I'd still like the paperwork," she said, and he almost smiled at that, the dry, careful, almost smile she had learned in these last weeks to treasure precisely because it cost him something real to offer it, The trial itself, when it came 2 days later in a courthouse borrowed from the county because Larkspur had none of its own, lasted the better part of a full day, and Adaline sat through every hour of it with Ruth's hand gripped tight in her own, watching a procession of men take the stand who, 6 months earlier, would never have dared speak against Ezra Thorne in any room where he might hear of it. Jed Marsh testified first, his voice steady despite the sweat visible at his collar, describing the night of the barn fire in plain, unembellished sentences, the torches, the colonel's own voice giving the order, the names of the men who'd struck the match. The 2 frightened riders who had sheltered in the line shack followed him, each confirming what Jed had said and adding details of their own, the weight of their combined testimony building into something no single witness could have carried alone. Then came the sworn statement from Elijah Briggs, read aloud by the judge himself since the old man's health hadn't permitted the journey south, an account of a will properly signed, properly witnessed, and of a conversation, overheard weeks before Adaline's father died, in which Thorne had told an associate that the Kirby debt would be settled, one way or the other, whether the old man signs willing or not. Cole Briggs took the stand last, and it was there, under oath, that he laid out the full ledger of payments he'd received to bury the warrant and delay the courts. Dates, amounts, the particular arithmetic of a man's conscience sold off in pieces, small enough that each one, alone, had seemed survivable. Before the ruling itself, Whitcomb allowed one further statement into the record, read aloud not by the woman who'd written it, but by the judge himself, out of consideration for a witness too far along in years to make the journey south in person. The courtroom listened in a silence heavier than any that had come before, as Whitcomb read the account of a widow near the Powder River, of a boy named Caleb, of water rights coveted, and a family destroyed by increments long before the Kirby name had ever crossed Thorne's ambitions. This statement does not on its own establish criminal liability for the disappearance it describes, Whitcomb said, setting the pages down with visible care, but it establishes beyond any reasonable doubt in this court's estimation a pattern this defendant has practiced for years against families with no means to defend themselves. I will weigh that pattern heavily in whatever sentence follows a conviction on the charges properly before me today. For the first time since his arrest, something in Thorne's composure faltered. Not guilt, exactly, Adaline thought, watching him from her seat beside Ruth, but the particular fury of a man watching a debt he'd never expected to be asked to pay finally come due in full, decades of quiet cruelty suddenly rendered visible in a single afternoon's accounting. The will presented by Miss Kirby, Whitcomb said when the last witness had stepped down and the courtroom had gone still, is authentic, properly witnessed, and stands as the final legal disposition of the Kirby land grant. Any contract purporting to transfer that land to Colonel Ezra Thorne is hereby voided as the product of coercion and fraud. Colonel Thorne is remanded for trial on charges of fraud, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. Somewhere behind Adaline, a coyote called from the ridgeline outside the courthouse window, faint and unbothered by the verdict inside, the way the wilderness has always been unbothered by what men decide is justice among themselves. Thorne was led out past her in chains, and for one moment their eyes met, and Adaline found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt nothing resembling triumph, only the tired relief of a woman who has finally set down a weight she never should have been made to carry in the first place. He said nothing to her as the deputies led him past, though his eyes lingered a moment longer than was comfortable, some last calculation still working behind them even in chains, the habit of a man who had spent his whole life believing every situation held an angle left to work if he simply looked hard enough. She did not look away from him. She had done enough looking away these last weeks to last the rest of her life, and she found she owed him nothing further, not her fear, not her anger, not even the satisfaction of watching him break. He was simply a man being led out of a room, smaller now than he'd ever allowed himself to appear, and she let him go without ceremony, the way a person finally sets down a stone they've been carrying so long, its weight had started to feel like part of their own body. Outside the courthouse, the town of Larkspur had gathered in numbers larger than the church had held, word having traveled through every store and stable in the hours since the trial began, and the sound that greeted the verdict when it reached the crowd waiting in the street was not quite a cheer, more subdued than that, more the collective exhale of a town that had spent years afraid to say a name out loud and had just watched that name finally answer for itself in the open light of day. That evening, with the land legally hers again, and nothing left standing on it but the house and the burned frame of the barn, Adaline found Silas at the edge of the property, looking out at the black scar where the fire had been. "You could have delivered me the way you were paid to," she said. "Nobody would have known the difference until it was too late to matter." "I did know the difference," he said. "That's the part I couldn't live with." "Why?" He turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since the pasture, she watched him choose his words the way a man chooses them, when the cost of getting them wrong is higher than any fee. "I've spent 10 years being paid to make people disappear quietly. I told myself it didn't matter who they were, as long as I didn't ask. Then I watched 6 men point guns at a woman in a wedding dress, and understood I'd been asking the wrong question my whole life. Not who's paying. Who's kneeling?" Adaline said nothing for a long moment, only studied him with the same careful attention she'd given every man since her father died, and found, for the first time, no seam, no lie waiting underneath. "I'm rebuilding the barn," she said finally. "I'm going to need someone who knows which end of a hammer to hold, and who doesn't run when the Colonel's friends come asking questions. I'd rather it be someone I chose than someone Cheyenne sent me." "Is that a job offer or something else?" "It's whatever you decide to make it," she said. "I'm done letting other people write the terms of what happens to me." In the weeks that followed, Adaline found herself unable to look at the recovered deed to her father's land without thinking of every other woman in the territory who did not have a Ruth Calloway hiding a will inside a family Bible, who did not have a Silas Vane willing to burn his own instructions rather than deliver them. She raised the idea with Ruth one evening over mending that no longer needed to be done in secret, the good dress finally repaired and hung rather than worn in flight. "There are women all through this territory married the way I nearly was," Adaline said, "not always at gunpoint. Sometimes just at the point of a debt, or a father's decision, or a law that never bothered asking what the woman wanted. I keep thinking about what it would have meant, kneeling in that field, to know there was somewhere to run that wasn't just luck and a stranger's conscience." "You're thinking of building something," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking the land my father died defending ought to defend somebody else, now that it's safe to. A house here, open to any woman who needs a door she can bar herself, and time enough to find her own Ruth Calloway or her own Judge Whitcomb before some man decides her signature belongs to him." It took the better part of a year to build in truth, a second smaller house near the property line, modest but sound, funded in part by the settlement the courts eventually ordered from what remained of Thorne's seized assets, and staffed in its early months by exactly the kind of women Adaline had imagined that evening over the mending, 2 who had fled their own forced arrangements, 1 widow whose husband's debts had nearly cost her the roof over her children's heads, and Ruth herself, presiding over the whole operation with the same steady competence she'd once brought to raising a motherless girl into the woman now standing at its head. Jed Marsh built the sign that hung above its door with his own hands. Simple lettering burned into a plank of wood salvaged from the old barn's timbers before the new one went up around it. "Kirby House, a door that holds." Adaline had wept, seeing it finished, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to weep since the morning Ruth braided her hair before the trial. Ruth stayed on, of course, running the house exactly as she always had, though now she trained 2 young women from Larkspur whose own families had suffered under Thorne's dealings for years, and who came to the Kirby land looking for honest work, and Adaline suspected a kind of proof that a woman could rebuild something out of what a man like the Colonel had tried to burn down. Jed Marsh, pardoned for his testimony and unable to return to ranch work anywhere the Colonel's old associate still held influence, took a permanent place in the Kirby stables, and it was there, months later, that Adaline would find him teaching a green colt to trust the pressure of a hand on its neck rather than fear it. Patient, unhurried, the same lesson he himself had needed to learn the night he stood behind Ruth's stable with his hat in his hands. Reverend Doyle, for his part, never returned to Larkspur's pulpit. He came to the Kirby land once in the 3rd month after the trial, standing awkwardly at the edge of the property with his hat in his hands in an unconscious echo of Jed's own surrender months before. "I performed that ceremony knowing what it was," he said, not quite meeting her eyes even now. "I told myself a marriage under duress was still a marriage in the eyes of God, because it let me sleep at night. I don't believe that anymore. I don't know that I believe much of anything the way I used to. I came to say I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth to you now." Adaline studied him for a long moment, weighing the apology the way she'd learned to weigh every offering since the pasture, not for its size, but for what it cost the man making it. "It's worth something," she said finally. "Not everything, but something. I hope you find a congregation somewhere that needs a man who's finally learned what his silence costs other people." He nodded and left, and Adaline never saw him again, though she heard, years later, that he'd taken up work in a mission far to the north, among people who had never heard the story of the wedding he'd once performed at gunpoint. Otis, too, stayed on longer than anyone expected of a man who'd made his living moving between other people's troubles. Not on the Kirby land itself, but nearby in a small cabin at the edge of the property that Adaline insisted on building for him the same season as the new barn, in gratitude for a rifle shot from a tree stump that had saved her life before she'd even learned his name. He came by most evenings to share supper with Ruth and the hired girls, gruff and quiet and utterly devoted, in his own undemonstrative way, to the strange little family that had assembled itself out of the wreckage of that first terrible morning. He never spoke much of the war he and Silas had shared, nor of the years of quiet, dangerous work that had followed it, but Adaline noticed, in the months after the trial, that his hands had begun to lose the particular readiness they'd carried at the pasture, the reflexive nearness to his rifle, the habit of a man who never fully believed the danger had passed, watching him relax by degrees into the ordinary rhythms of supper and small talk, and Ruth's insistence that he take a second helping of anything she'd cooked. Adaline understood that Kirby House had become, without anyone quite planning it, a place where more than just frightened women learned to set down what they'd been carrying. 6 months later, the new barn stood taller than the old one, and Adaline Kirby walked the north pasture in the same season the ambush had found her, though this time she walked it upright, deed in hand, land legally and entirely her own, Ruth Calloway teaching the 2 new hired girls the running of the house behind her, and Jed Marsh breaking a colt in the corral with the patient hands of a man finally doing work he could be proud to write home about. The first woman had arrived at Kirby House only a month earlier, a girl not much younger than Adaline had been, fled from a ranch 2 counties over where her stepfather had already sold her, on paper to a rancher 3 times her age. She had come in the night, on foot, having walked the last 6 miles after her horse threw a shoe, and when Ruth opened the door to her, the girl had said only, "Someone told me there's a door here that holds," before her legs gave out from exhaustion and relief in equal measure. Adaline had sat with her until dawn, holding her hand the way Ruth had once held her own through the worst of that first terrible week, and had understood, watching the girl finally sleep, that the true measure of everything survived in that pasture was not the deed now safe in a lawyer's strong box in Larkspur, nor the barn rebuilt taller than before, but this, a stranger's daughter sleeping safe under a roof that existed because one woman had refused to let her own worst week become the last word on who she was allowed to become. Word of Thorne's conviction had traveled far enough by then that Adaline occasionally received letters from women in territories she'd never visited asking cautiously whether the stories were true, whether a woman really had stood in a courtroom and made a judge listen, whether there was truly a house on Kirby land where a door, once barred, actually held. She answered every one herself, in her own hand, the same hand that had once trembled signing a stranger's name to a marriage she never chose, now steady enough to offer the same thing Ruth had once offered her, proof, plain and undeniable, that it was possible to come out the other side of it standing. A full year after the pasture, Kirby House had grown to shelter 5 women at once, and it was in that season that a rider arrived at the gate carrying a letter from the cousin near the Powder River, the same woman whose written account of a boy named Caleb had helped seal Thorne's sentencing. She wrote to say she had finally, after years of silence, felt able to visit the river where the boy had last been seen, and to leave flowers there, something she had never before found the courage to do, while the man responsible still walked free and unaccountable in the world. She thanked Adaline plainly, without excess sentiment, for having made that small, overdue peace possible, and closed the letter with a line Adaline read aloud to Ruth that evening, both of them sitting by the same hearth, where a burned scrap of paper had once revealed the whole shape of Thorne's intentions. Justice delayed is still justice, so long as someone finally insists on it. Adaline pinned the letter inside the cover of her father's Bible, beside the space where the will had once been hidden, a quiet reminder that the fight in that pasture had never truly been about one family's land alone, but about every quiet cruelty allowed to continue simply because No one yet had proof enough, or courage enough, or a stranger willing to burn his own instructions rather than deliver them. She walked the property that afternoon the way she had every anniversary since the trial, tracing the same path her father used to walk, checking fence lines, pausing at the spot where the old barn's beam had once marked her height each year of her childhood. A new beam had been raised in its place, and Silas had insisted, over her initial objection that the gesture felt indulgent, on marking a fresh set of notches into the fresh wood. Not her childhood height alone this time, but a line for each of the women who had passed through Kirby House in its first year, a quiet monument to everyone the land had sheltered, rather than merely to the family that had once claimed it exclusively as their own. She ran her fingers along those notches now, feeling the small variations in height, in circumstance, in whatever private grief had first brought each woman to that door, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, that her father would have understood this better than the will alone could express. That land, properly tended, was never meant to belong to just one family's fear of losing it, but to whatever purpose the people living on it decided it was worth protecting. Silas found her there, at the tree line, the same tree line the riders had come from, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the field between them wide and green and entirely unguarded. "You're still here," she said. "I keep meaning to leave," he said. "Something keeps deciding otherwise." She held out her hand, not for a shake, not for rescue, an offer, plain and equal, the kind she had never once been given the choice to extend before the pasture taught her what her own voice was worth. He took it. "There's something I never told you," he said, his hand still around hers, warm and steady. "That first night in the line shack, when you barred the door and tested it with your own hand, I made a decision then that I've kept every day since, even the ones where I doubted whether I'd earned the right to. I decided I'd rather die making sure that door held than ever be the reason it didn't." "You never said." "Didn't think I needed to until now. Seemed like the kind of thing better shown than spoken, and I hope these 6 months have shown it plainly enough." "They have," she said, "though I won't pretend it wouldn't have saved us both some trouble, hearing it sooner." He almost smiled, the real one this time, unguarded, the one that had taken her weeks to learn how to earn from him back when trust between them was still a thing, rationed carefully, one small proof at a time. "Otis says the same thing, says I'm slow to say what matters and quick to say what doesn't. I expect he's right, the way he usually is about me." "Then let's not waste any more of what's left unsaid," Adaline said, and there was nothing tentative in it, nothing of the woman who had knelt in that field 5 days into the worst week of her life, waiting on other men to decide what happened to her next. "I've got a barn standing where a fire tried to leave nothing behind, a deed with my own name on it and no one else's, and land enough for both of us to build whatever this is going to become. That's more say than I've had over my own life in longer than I care to remember. I don't intend to waste an hour of it staying quiet about what I want." "And what do you want?" he asked, though something in his eyes suggested he already knew, had known perhaps since the creek where he told her grief doesn't ask permission for what it attaches itself to. "You," she said simply, "standing exactly where you're standing now for as long as you're willing to keep choosing it, not because Cheyenne sent you, not because a letter told you where to deliver me, because you decided of your own will that this valley and this woman were worth staying for." "Then it's decided," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." Behind them, the valley stretched out gold and unclaimed by anyone's forged signature, and the wind moved through it the way it always had, indifferent to colonels and courts alike, carrying only the sound of a colt learning to trust the hand that held its reins, and a woman who had learned, at last, to hold her own, not because the world had grown gentler, but because she had grown certain in the hardest way possible of exactly what she was worth and exactly who deserved to stand beside her while she claimed it.